Okay, thank you everybody, and sorry for the slight delay, but wonderful to see everybody here. For those who don't know me, I'm Simon Haberley, and I'm the Director of the School of Culture, History and Language, the area that's hosting the event tonight. But just to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to just reflect on what a very difficult week this has been for all our First Nations colleagues and friends, and to be part of that mourning week, of which we are coming to the conclusion of, but I'm very pleased to be able to at least host this meeting on a very special occasion, which is the Jack Golson Lecture. And it's wonderful. This is a lecture series that occurs every 2 years, and it's wonderful to be able to host that. It celebrates Jack's amazing contribution to the world of prehistory, archaeology, and a whole range of interdisciplinary studies. He pioneered and was the founder, in fact, of prehistory here at ANU, and influenced many of us in the audience. And of course, Jack would have been here, and it was here with every of the Jack Golson lectures. But of course, unfortunately, Jack passed away on the 2nd of September last month. And so last night there was a wonderful celebration and memorial to Jack in the Coombs building, a place where Jack spent a lot of hours, of course, and talking to many of us here, and having not just talking, but having great intellectual conversations and ideas, and usually over a beer or two and the odd cigarette. But anyway, that was a wonderful thing about Jack, and how he was such a icon for many of us. And it's great to have Kate and Toby, I think, in the audience tonight. It's really wonderful for you to be here again, and always welcome and in the ANU and at the Coombs building. It's wonderful to see you here. So really, it's my job to just give you general welcome, I guess, but it's really also, I'd like to just acknowledge that our Dean of the College, Helen Sullivan, is here. So it's wonderful to have Helen as well as one of our dignitaries. We were hoping to have some of the embassy staff from some of the Pacific Island embassies here as well, but unfortunately that wasn't able to take place, but that's okay. But I'd like to really just hand over to Stuart, but to introduce our guest speaker. But before I hand over, just to remind people that at the end of this talk, there'll be a little time for Q&A, but we'll invite everybody after that, probably around 8 or a bit after 8 o'clock, to the balcony, which is just around the corner here, where we've got some drinks, and we can continue the conversation there. So please come along to that. Thanks, Stuart.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Simon, and wonderful to see you all here tonight. The Jack Golson Lecture is always a wonderful event. All sorts of eclectic people, and always a great speaker. And just like to reiterate Simon's comments about Jack's children being here tonight. So, Peter Shepherd was once a teacher of mine when I was doing a master's, and that's not the reason I invited him to be the Golson Lecturer this year. But I think Peter's always been amazed that I went on to do a PhD and did anything academic. But I'm very, very pleased to welcome him tonight as the speaker. Peter was born a Canadian. He still sounds like a Canadian, but did his PhD at the University of Toronto in the 1980s, but wisely chose field work in North Africa, looking at lithic stone tools, and primarily looking at their chemical characterization, so archaeological science. And with that ticket, potentially could go anywhere in the world. And luckily for him, he was in contact with the late Professor Roger Green at Auckland University, and managed to get a postdoc I think 1988, arriving in Auckland for a postdoc, one of the few in Auckland, and certainly the only one that's ever got a permanent position, I imagine. So Roger clearly very happy with his work, and he was assigned the task of making some sense of the lithics that Roger had recovered in the Reef Santa Cruz excavations of the Southeast Solomons. So that really started a connection. He was sent up almost immediately to the Southeast Solomons, and that started a long career and collaboration with Solomon Islanders and many fellow academics and students working particularly in the western province of the Solomons. And still he's a emeritus professor now, but still very much connected to the Solomon Islands communities and continuing his research. Tonight, the wonderful Case 32, it's a wonderful start to the title. It's initially a focus on punitive expeditions, this sort of communal punishment that was very prevalent all over the globe in the 19th century and even earlier, and still very much something that we see in different parts of the world today. It changed a lot of communities and islands in the Southwest Pacific, and I think very much is underdone in terms of contemporary politics and policy being aware of these things. So he's going to give us a wonderful intro to that, but also looking at it in the deep time perspective, because we all know that the Solomons at least is occupied by people for 30,000 years, if not longer. And this is another aspect I often get a little bit upset about: contemporary politicians and governments making decisions and have this concept of the Southwest Pacific as not being able to often look after their own affairs, whereas they've been there for sort of 40 or 50,000 years. So I think that's probably enough for me, and I introduce Peter Shepherd.
I think I'll start with a little bit of water. It's much drier in Australia than in Auckland, well, as I was saying to people the other day, if it rains for less of an hour, we think it's a really good day. So thanks, Stuart. I'm incredibly honored to give this talk. A bit surprised, really, but very pleased. I didn't know Jack very well, but I would see Jack and Claire at conferences, and they almost always, they sat in the front rows, and they sat there quietly taking it all in, and I always sort of felt that they were emanating kindness. I could sort of sense a kindness coming off of those people, and so they were pretty special. I think one thing I might share with Jack is that we're both sort of accidental Pacific archaeologists. I don't think Jack, when he was studying medieval archaeology in Cambridge, anticipated ending up in the Antipodes and becoming a cornerstone of the development of archaeology and prehistory in this part of the world. In 1954, he arrived at what was then Auckland University College. It was before the establishment of the University of Auckland, actually, where I think fireworks must have gone off. You can just imagine Auckland in 1954. It was probably a pretty sleepy place. But when Jack got there, all of a sudden, he just attracted people from all over the university. People came from art, they came from English, they came from everywhere because he was the hottest ticket on campus. And some years ago, I gave a lecture to a University of the Third Age. I mean, this must be about 15 or 20 years ago now. Lecture of the University of the Third Age. And afterwards, a very elegant woman came up to me and sort of said, with a twinkle in her eye, that she had been one of Jack's people. Because almost immediately that Jack got to Auckland, he created the Auckland Archaeological Society, which is the oldest archaeological society in New Zealand, and I guess older than the Canberra Archaeological Society. which he maybe modeled after the Auckland Archaeological Society. But what Jack did was collect a group of people from all over the university to go out and do archaeology. And this woman said, you know, it was just the most amazing thing. It was so wonderful. We were out there camping on Motu Tapu, and with sort of a twinkle in her eye, you can just imagine all the excitement in sleepy Auckland in 1954. Now, I don't think any fireworks went off when I arrived in Auckland. I mean, Jack had been invited to come to Auckland. Maybe he wasn't very happy about it, but he was invited to come to Auckland at a garden party at Cambridge. Well, I was invited. I was working excavating Kabaran sites in northern Jordan in 1987, and we went down to Amman for some R&R, and I got a telegram from Roger Green saying, please come to Auckland and study Lepidolithics. And I sort of went, New Zealand, yeah, somewhere near Australia. South Pacific, so it'll be palm trees and white sand beaches. For Canadians, of course, you know, south is always good. They rarely ever think that if you keep going south, it starts to get colder again, but anyhow. And Lepida, well, I'd heard the word Lepida once in a course I tutored in first year, and so that was about all I knew. Although I was always saying to Peter White the other day, one of the only papers I've ever read was an early paper by Peter White, which was very influential on the young lithic analyst, because Peter was doing some pretty interesting things in New Guinea. But anyhow, so I came to Auckland for a 2-year postdoc with my family, and almost within a year, Roger shipped me off to the Solomons, which I tell you, I was pretty nervous. I mean, I worked in Algeria, I worked in Jordan, I worked in Portugal, I worked in various other places, but the Solomons sounded, God, what am I getting into here? But what I got into was the most amazing, most fascinating place in the world, really, as far as I can tell. And I have done work in quite a few different locations. And so that brings us to the subject of our talk today. And what I'm going to tell you is a small story, but I'm going to put it within the big context. And so it's about the history of an event, what I'm going to talk about today, essentially. So what we see here is a how. It's a ritual. It's 7 meters long. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, 7 meters long. It was used in Roviana, in the Western Solomons, is a ritual bowl for preparation of puddings, pounding up cooked taro and gnarly nuts and that sort of thing. And it was a ritual, a going forth ritual from canoe house before going on headhunting raids. And it's a metaphorical canoe. You got to imagine 11 men on each side rhythmically pounding the taro and gnarly nuts. It's like paddling the canoes. And so, so this beautiful thing on September 25th, 1891, was taken from a canoe house on the island of Nusa Roviana in Roviana Lagoon by Captain Edward Davis of HMS Royalist. Well, his Marines, there was 60 Marines and sailors. And after they took this, they burnt that canoe house and all the houses for 6 kilometers. In fact, they affected the lives of about, I would estimate, about 3,000 people. And so, and then Davis came and gave this beautiful thing to Admiral Scott, who was the head of the Australian station of the British Navy here in Sydney, or there in Sydney. Scott subsequently donated to the British Museum where it is today. But you know, what I'm going to talk about is why that event happened, or at least suggest some reasons for it, how it happened. So Solomon Islands, for those of you who don't really know where it is, you can see it up here, and I include in the Solomon Islands Bougainville and Buka, which are politically part of PNG, of course, but culturally really part of Solomon Islands. And the area we're talking about here is the western province of the Solomon Islands, the New Georgia group, and here is where Roviana Lagoon is. And it was on this island of Nusa Roviana that these events, and so what I'm going to talk about today mostly plays out, in this region just in here. Now, the HMS Royalist was the flagship of the Northern Division of the Australian Station of the British Navy. And every year, there would be a cruise of the Royalist or other ships in which they were investigating cases. It was like a police car. They were assigned cases to investigate. Usually they were attacks on British subjects or European subjects, or problems with labor trade or gun running, that sort of thing. And so they would go and have to investigate this case, that case, and we're going to talk today about case 32. I mean, you can just imagine, this is the biggest ship that they've probably ever seen. It was the most powerful one, you know, steam corvette, so it needed coal. And so it had coaling stations, and that's what it would do as well. It'd visit all the coaling stations through the Solomon Islands. A complement of 200, 8 6-inch guns. It had a steam cutter as well, which they used to get into tight locations. And as I was saying, it was, you know, like a patrol car, policing operation. And it was assisted when need be with a couple of other gunboats. They had a mountain gun artillery as well, which they could put down into the steam cutter, and that will allow them to get up into tight locations where the Royalists couldn't go, and then they could use that to shell villages and locations. So the Royalists on the 24th of September came around the top of New Georgia and came down here into this area here, the Hawthorne Sounds, the Diamond Narrows region here, and anchored. This is a very shallow lagoon. They couldn't get in there. So then they took the steam cutter and other whaleboats and moved down here. And then they went over to this little island of Nusa Zonga, where at that time there was 3 trading stations here, Nusa Zonga, Hambu Peka, and Hambu Hambu down here. And they went to Nusa Zonga on the 24th. They assembled local chiefs and elders and said, if you don't bring the man who killed this man, William Dablé, at this trading station here, along with 2 native boys, which were Malaitans, and also, I should say, they kidnapped a Malaitan woman who was there. If you don't deliver them by tomorrow, we'll declare war on you. And that's, you know, how what their relationships were. It was because they weren't, you know, this wasn't the British Solomon Islands. They were engaging with other nations, and so the only way they could do this in this sort of way was by declaring war on them. And so they said they'd declare war on them, and the next day they did. And they came across here to Nusa Roviana and burnt all the villages there. And I think, if you look in the records of the British Museum, it would suggest that how comes from Kalikongu region, the Bayside over here. But it's quite possible it came from this Buragari side over here, because the men who were guilty of this murder of a trader, the trader's assistant, were actually here. But they were from Bella La Bella. They'd married in to this location. And in fact, they weren't anywhere around. They'd already left. It was impossible for the Roviana people to bring the culprits, because they weren't there at all. The British knew that as well, actually. But that didn't stop them from going ahead here. And so they started torching the canoes and the houses, and you can just imagine the ancestral shrines, all the stuff for in Nusa Roviana, presumably all the villages in Nusa Roviana, but then they moved over to the mainland, and they moved along about 6 kilometers along the mainland, torching all the villages, only stopping when they got to the middle of what is today Munda, where the chief there, the Bangara there, was their chief interlocutor, the man that they dealt with regularly. And they left his canoe houses untouched, because hopefully he would cooperate with them. And his name was Ngava. He wasn't there. He knew better than to be around. He was off fishing. But anyhow, so the burning goes on. People fled across to the mainland, and the canoes, the big Tomoko raiding canoes that we'll talk about, were moved up into the lagoons, which is very, very shallow, and there was no way. And also, the British were always really under the instructions to not pursue or not go inland because they thought it would be too dangerous. And so quite often they would just, prior to 1891, because this action was fairly, and the action, I don't have time to give you the big story. That would be a 2-hour story. That would be the deluxe version of this talk. But my wife, or Stuart, told me that if it was more than an hour, you'd all be off at the bar. I could go as long as I wanted, but anyhow. And here's the class picture. At the end, that Sisiata with Ngava's canoe houses left standing, but everything to the west of there was burnt, and on Nusa Roviana burnt as well. You can see the sailors and Marines, and imagine these were the couple of traders who were there. The trader who owned the station where the assistant trader had been killed was absent. He was in Sydney writing letters to the Sydney Morning Herald complaining about attacks on his station, because he'd been attacked many times because the people hated him for reasons which we will get into a little bit, but anyhow. And so at the end of the year, there's a report made, big, thick, type report of all the activities of that particular ship during the year. And each case got reported upon, and this is the report of case 32 of Davis saying, I've destroyed 400 houses, 150 canoes, 1,000 heads, and these were the headhunting skulls which were displayed in the canoe houses, and we'll talk about that later. And in Gooley's house, and they knew that Gooley was the man from Bella Lavella that they were really looking for, but he'd gone back to Bella Lavella. And they really wanted to get at the canoes, these raiding canoes, which we'll see in a minute here. But they couldn't in this particular case. So there's a raiding Tomoko. That picture was taken in 1894 by John Thurston, who was the Western Pacific High Commissioner, and he was visiting just after the British Solomon Protectorate had been declared, although in practical terms not yet functional. But he was there visiting and took this picture, and that would be the area where Ngava's canoe houses were. These beautiful plank-built Tomoko would hold up to 32 men, and they would go long distances in these things, 150 kilometers, 200 kilometers with nothing. And that's Ngava himself. That's a portrait in 1906. It's his obituary, which was published in the Royal Anthropological Institute of Ireland, and Ireland and something. But anyhow, Rain in those times. And they published his picture, his obituary. So geography, as I said, the Solomon Islands is about 1,000 kilometers long, and it's got these water gaps to the north and the south. the gap to the north across into the Bismarck Archipelago. And in the south, it's about 400 kilometers across to Tuamotu, the region out in remote Oceania beyond the main Solomon Islands, where you find Reef Santa Cruz and Tumaco and various other islands, Vanikoro, going on down into Vanuatu. The reason why you get this double chain really is because we've got here the Pacific plate trying to subduct underneath the Australian plate, essentially. And so what's happened is it's, you know, a very complex geological history here, but two fairly significant things for me is what's happened out here. All that yellow, those are marine limestones. And what's happened there is the Pacific plates come along, and out to the east is the Ontong Java submarine plateau. And it's about the size of the continental United States. And so it gradually moved along, and then it didn't want to get subducted, got stuck and pushed up. And so it pushed up those marine limestones. And those marine limestones actually contain that chert that Roger Green had found in the Reef Santa Cruz. And that's where I went when I went there in 1989. And this is a bit of an aside. I better not have too many asides or get in trouble. It's a bit of an aside. I went looking for the chert, so I spent a very wet night going across on what was the Compass Rose then, an old boat, across to Malaita. In the morning, I staggered up the street looking for chert, and I got to the bank, and the bank was made out of chert. And then every river I looked in was made, I mean, beautiful. This looked like English chalk flint. This is a beautiful, beautiful material. But anyhow, at that time, after doing that, finding tons of chert, I went off and had people say, go to the Western Solomons, it's beautiful there, and so I did. And that's how I got into that part of the world, but anyhow. But out here in the Western Solomons, you can see all these circular structures, and what that is andesitic and basaltic volcanism. And that's created sort of a whole series of islands close to one another and a lot of lagoons. And so there's a complex history of subsidence and uplift, tectonically quite active. In the 2007, I think it was, Easter earthquake there, some areas got raised up to 1 meter. Other areas, one end of Rivervana Lagoon went down, the other end went up. It's a very complex kind of place, but anyhow. Now, one of the things in the Solomons, which I think is pretty important really, is sort of what I call inner and outer coast. If you're on an inner coast, when you look out, you see neighboring islands. And so you see connections. And so you're in Rivervana, you look out, you see Rendova, you can, some areas you look out and you'll see Gizo, and you know to the north there's Kolumbangra and a whole bunch of other things. And so it's an interior. If you're on the outer coast, you're just looking out at empty ocean. But in the areas where you have, in the inner coast, you have lots of neighbors and friends, and that facilitates a lot of interaction within that region. And what you find in any of those places as you move along the Solomon chain, where you get a lot of that sort of situation like you have here in the Western Solomons, is sort of cultural interaction spheres, which will cover, you know, the ends of islands and across to the neighboring islands on the other side of the chain and that sort of thing. So I think that's a pretty important thing. It creates a very highly networked, easily accessible group of islands. And Munda sits at the center in a sheltered, resource-rich lagoon, which is an optimal location, really. Now back to the beginning. As Stuart said, the main Solomons were settled by at least 29,000 years ago, work coming out of ANU with Matthew and Wickler. And before that, Jim Specht, who is here today. We've got at Kilu Cave, archaeology dating back 29,000 years. This was a hunting and collecting, gathering kind of lifestyle at that time. And also at that time, because the waters, you know, in the glacial maximum were much lower, up to 100 meters lower, we get would have been one of the largest islands in that whole region, I think, at this time. Greater Bougainville or Bukidia or whatever you want to call it. It comes all the way down here, connecting up Choiseul and Bougainville and Santa Isabel, and then down through the Florida group or the Gela group. And then I think it was only about, 300 or 400 meters across to Guadalcanal. So it's quite possible, if we got people here 29,000 years ago, they could have walked. Now, they obviously could do more than walk at that time, but you would think that there'd be something down there. We haven't really found anything else other than at Bataluma Pusavi, David Rowe, again out of this department, that has dates at the bottom of that rock shelter there just outside of Honiara, about 6,000 BP. And there's palynology, nice cores and things that go along with that indicate people are there at that time. And then if you look to the linguistics, we've got through this region some Papuan languages, and you can see their distribution here, or what was called East Papuan. And this is, the farthest to the east that Papuan, so-called Papuan languages get, here at Savo, just off of near Honiara, really. And the thing about those languages is that they're highly variable, and it was very hard for linguists to sort of relate one to another. And what that suggests to you, of course, is that there's considerable time depth. And so there's, again, an argument for people here a long time. Done and all, doing sort of cladistic or analysis of this data, linguistic data suggests breakup maybe 10,000 years ago. Presumably, the rest of the Solomons was covered with related languages at that time. And then we get Austronesians coming in sometime after 3,000 years ago. Today, of the 70 extant languages in the political Solomon Islands, 68 are Austronesian. There's two large language families. We have Northwest Solomonic going up here and extending on up into New Ireland and the Bismarck region, and Southeast Solomonic down here. And Malcolm Ross would suggest that, the difference across this border is like the difference between French and German. And if you talk to Solomon Islanders, they would say, people here would say, oh yeah, I can hear those other languages, but they'd say, I can't hear these people over here. And so I think we can probably say that we can understand that the origins of Northwest Solomonic coming down out of the Bismarcks, but Southeast Solomonic is a mystery, which we don't have time to go into. I think if Andrew Pauly was here, we'd have to ask him where Southeast Solomonic comes from. Still a big mystery, but not part of today's story. And it's presumed that Austronesian was spoken by the Lapita archaeological culture, certainly out in remote Oceania, out beyond the Solomon Islands, where there are no Papuan languages. But it's not necessarily the case, really, in near Oceania, is it? Archaeologists don't dig up languages. And as we'll see today, there's some possibly sort of late Lapita-like material located on islands where people only speak Papuan languages, so it's not necessarily an either or a done deal that it's Austronesian. But anyhow, generally we believe Austronesian is associated with these languages. With Lapita is associated with these Austronesian languages. Now, jumping ahead a bit, in 2006, my colleague Richard Walter and I published a paper which is fairly controversial at the time. We said some audacious things about linguistics, and Andrew Pauly sort of slapped me around a little bit and said, Peter, that can't be true. I said, okay, what do I know about linguistics? But anyhow, what we proposed based on our archaeology and the available genetics and linguistics at the time, that Lapita, rather than the assumption had been that people had just you know, those Austronesian languages we saw in the Solomon Islands just reflected the movement of Lapita gradually down through the Solomons and then on out into the rest of the Pacific. It was a very simple story. But in 2006, we suggested that what had happened, in fact, was a bypass. They had leapfrogged across out into the Reef Santa Cruz about 3,000 years ago, which, you know, I mean, aside from what we thought was making sense of the data available at the time, it also helped us think a little bit about the speed of Lapita, because Lapita moves fast. And so if you got to sort of accommodate a culture growing in some sort of diffusionary way through these large islands of the Solomons, the speed was you know, a bit puzzling. Subsequently to then, our suggestion has been confirmed by genetic analysis and looking at the genetics of the area where Matthew and Stuart are working in Vanuatu, looking at Lapita genetics, looking at a lot of genetics in the Solomon Islands, and also looking at, and that indicates that the connections out in remote Oceania are most closely going into Bismarck's, into New Britain or someplace thereabouts. Gets a bit complicated because people also have histories, and so where people are today may not be where they were 3,000 years ago, but anyhow. And the same holds with languages. The languages of the Reef Santa Cruz were all a bit of a puzzle, always a puzzle. People couldn't understand them. The fundamental reason, again, as a non-linguist, seemed to me that they should be like the languages immediately to the west. They're neighboring languages, but they weren't like the neighboring languages in the main Solomon Islands. They were completely, very, very different indeed. And so it was suggested that maybe they were Papuan languages or there was some weird kind of mixture. Well, today we say, you know, they are most closely related possibly to languages up in the Bismarck Archipelago, maybe in the Musau region. And so the language, linguistics, genetics, and as I will sort of discuss here in a minute, the archaeology would suggest that yes, there is this leapfrog. One interesting thing is that subsequent to that initial movement, we do get Papuan genetics moving out into remote Oceania. And it's a bit of a puzzle in itself because it's sort of like a trickle, although there may be, but is there leapfrogs? Because I don't think that, and I'm getting off topic again, but I don't think the genetics of those Papuan people in Vanuatu, or the Papuan genetics in Vanuatu are related in any easy way to the Solomon Islands. And so that's another, I think what we know today is that people made big moves, big bold moves, and you know, they're quite capable of going in long distances very, very rapidly. Why is always a bit of a puzzle. I mean, why once Austronesian, once Lapita got out into remote Oceania, why would other people follow in the same track? Although maybe that's just they've created that pathway, and people know about it, and so other people keep following. And again, you know, they don't have to be Austronesian speakers. They could be Papuan type peoples, and genetically could be quite varied. Now, when I went to the Solomons in 1989 and looked for the church, I said afterwards I went out to the Western Solomons and I met a man there who was to become my good friend Kenneth Roga, who worked for the Ministry of Cultural, he was a cultural affairs officer for the Western Solomon Islands. And he showed me a box of ceramics which had been found in Roviana Lagoon. I knew nothing about Lapita. I knew nothing about, I was a stone tool guy from Algeria, right? I mean, what did I know? But it looked sort of Lapita-ish to me, and so, oh, that's quite interesting. And then, of course, Matthew and Reeves published in 1980, you know, they went, and my understanding, visited the site in Roviana Lagoon and published about those collections and that stuff. So in 1996, or 1995 actually, I remembered seeing that material and I thought, oh, well, we'll go back to Roviana Lagoon and we'll see what we can find, because there must be Lapita there somewhere. It's steward kept telling me there's a Lapita there somewhere. And so we went back and started quite a long program of research there, many different islands. And what we did find is we found sort of very, very late Lapita dating somewhere around 2600 calibrated BP with some dentate stamping and some Lapita-ish pot forms. But it's right at the end, the tail end. So, you know, that's why in 2006 we said, well, the 3,000-year-old Lapita movement out into the remote Oceania bypassed this place, but later, about 2,600 or maybe 2,700, people up in the Bismarcks came down. And these are intertidal sites. And since then, we found, I think, over 30 intertidal sites with ceramics. And this is on Vela. Vela, this is the big Papuan-speaking island in the Western Solomons. And if you went in behind these stilt houses here, you would find intertidal ceramics like these in the mangroves back in there. And so we think that this was the kind of occupation. We know in Lapita, up in the Bismarck Archipelago, of course, that there are stilt house type traditions. And so they seem to have taken this on in a big way in the Western Solomons. If you look at this ceramic, one of the things you'll find is, well, you find a lot of incised things. The dentate stamping ends almost immediately. You get a lot of other incisions and then applique, but you get this crenulated pie crust sort of rim. And you can track that plus the other design systems all the way back up into New Ireland. And you can track it up to sites that Jack excavated. But also to work that students from ANU have subsequently done in that region. So as I say, we found over 30 intertidal sites. And there's, you know, I could just go to a map and say, yes, there'll be one here, there'll be one there, there'll be one there. There's just all over the place. And so here's Golson, 1991, Garling, 2002. They share that same pottery tradition. So remember that distribution of Northwest Solomonic. Because this tradition, this ceramic tradition carries on, and you know, people are making ceramics on Choiseul up until 1970. There's an old ceramic tradition. And we can see after the decline of this decorated ceramic, plainware, and we don't really know when. Well, we can see it in sort of 19th century, 18th century sites, but we don't know much about the ceramic sequence between the stuff that dates around 2600, maybe to 2000, and what we see a couple of thousand years later. But it seems to correspond to the distribution of Northwest Solomonic, because when you go east of that line, remember, so the Northwest Solomonic, Southeast Solomonic, and that line through there, and that's Tryon-Hackman line, over which we saw that big language difference. And in the Southeast Solomons, there is a very small handful of plain pottery from Santa Ana, which, you know, if I showed it to you, a lot of people would say, now, are you sure that's pottery? I mean, it's very friable, tiny little plain bits. It looks like pottery made by people who weren't really certain of what they're doing. And there's just very small amounts of it. And that's the only ceramics there. Recently, there's been reports of ceramics at the end of Guadalcanal, or at least one piece. Yeah, I mean, there may be stuff there, but culturally and linguistically, there's no ceramic tradition in this region, not like there is in the western part. So again, the leapfrog. The leapfrog. So you know, we have to think that Austronesians are coming in at this time if we get Northwest Solomonic coming down there. And they're bringing with them the domesticated plants and animals. And they're also bringing lots of concepts such as mana, be efficacious, tambu, or abu, various versions of tapu, sacred or forbidden. The idea of ancestors as extensions of effective society and their worship, and the potential for development of hereditary leadership through descent distinctions such as older and younger. And along with that, material cultures such as shell valuables and exchange, and obviously advanced maritime technologies, both sailing and paddle canoes. There are no sailing canoes, outrigger canoes, in the main Solomon Islands. You have to go up into the Bismarcks before you find that sort of thing. I mean, I did see one day, and historically there are none. And it turned out to be Micronesians who were brought into the Solomons in 1960s. So that whole region is sort of without that fancy sailing technology. What you see out in Reef Santa Cruz and Tumoto, it comes back at that point. But anyhow, again, a rabbit hole we could go down a long way, but I won't, or I get in trouble. So we know very little about the period following this ceramic period, but about 1200 AD, we get some archaeology in the interior behind Munda on New Georgia. We find, in terms of oral tradition, that's supposed to be the place where Roviana culture comes from, the interior hills in behind modern day Munda. And so there's what you would see historically. Ancestral shrines, which in Roviana they called Hope. And so there would be powerful ancestor skulls in that box up on top there. Now our research, we went into the area 6 kilometers back into the hills and camped in there and mapped the area called Bao, which traditionally is the homeland of Roviana people. And there is this is a large, what we call face shrine. And you can see big basalt columns and slabs, which have been hauled up from the rivers that, they're up on top of the hills here essentially. And here's these table stones we found that with them, big slabs mounted on top of small cobbles. And we got dates on this, and dates back to about 1200 AD. And so that corresponds. I mean, the Roviana people would say, well, yeah, this is going to be the oldest shrine, and sure enough, it was. And so there's lots of these kind of face shrines with massive effort in terms of moving up these big basalt columns and slabs to create these shrines all along the hills. If you just go back from the coast along Roviana Lagoon, you'll find these kinds of things. There's not much in the way of cultural material. There's usually a square sort of depression in one end of the platform, but it's empty. And we call them cysts, but there's nothing in them. There's always table stones, maybe 1, 2, or 3 of those table stone things. But there's none of the other features that we find historically with ancestral shrines. There's no ovens, no artifacts, no food remains, no bone, no human remains. They're clean. And we've dug around all outside them looking for things. Whereas you'll see, if you look at the material later period, there's all kinds of material. And so the unfaced shrine style starts about 1600 AD from our dating. And so here we have ancestral shrines, and there's just all kinds of material. There's ovens, there's food waste, there's all kinds of things. So there's huge dramatic difference between these two periods. And so what we think is we've got this early period, and then about 1600 AD we get the development of this later shrine form. And that And so here we've done archaeology on the island of Nusa Roviana over many years and mapped over 740 stone constructions. I mean, you know, that early photograph could have been taken in here off one of these wharfs. And so we've got village all the way around here. The Second World War, this whole area was bulldozed. And so we did excavate some very interesting, very anomalous features up in here, only to find bully beef cans at the bottom of them. They were artillery positions, American artillery positions. But up on top of the ridge is this big hill fort, which the main part of it extends here, about 740 meters long. And there's a whole series of walls, high stone walls, platforms, terraces, platforms running down the sides of the hill fort. But you can see some of it here. Very, you know, very elaborate construction. And that would seem to date about 1600. Dates about the time when we see that transformation in the shrine forms. Now, one of the things you find, of course, with these shrines is shell valuables of different kinds, many different kinds. But for Roviana people, shell money was crucial. And I use the word money. I mean, it was money. It had meaning attached to it as well, though. It's, you know, but it's what people wanted. It was their heart's desire to attract money to their houses. And what it did in practice is facilitate this economy, this regional economy where people could use shell money to procure commodities, procure taro. If you have a feast, you can paddle to the next island down and you could pay for your transactions. If you want the Bangara, the chief, wants to build a canoe, a very expensive, long process, he could pay for in shell money. If he wants to reward successful headhunting parties, he can do it with shell money. There's various kinds. The most valuable one is this bakiha. And the very interesting thing is, you can see that red stain on it. That's a very high value one. They were made from fossil Turdacna, giant Turdacna, found in the upraised reefs along the Roviana Lagoon. And from a Roviana perspective, those shells that they found there in those upraised reefs were the food waste of the gods. And so there's a connection to the gods with that particular kind of shell money. There's other, I mean, in general it's called Poata shell money, but there's different classes here, plain ones. And then Hokata, which is sort of the arm rings. Here you can see Ngava wearing a bakiha and arm rings. And that photo was very likely taken at that Nusa Zonga, that station where the royalists first came and told everyone to bring the guilty parties in. And then finally we have this very rough kind, which does seem to be the old, people would say it's the oldest variety, and in terms of our limited dating, it would suggest maybe it is the oldest variety. And here's a big piece of fossil Turdacna. As I said, money, even the money that we use today, has meaning attached to it. And the world of bakiha, or the shell money, is a very complicated one, and I don't have time really to go in here other than to say it facilitated exchanges of all kinds, social exchanges, commodity exchanges, and it memorialized things. You know, it was used, but particular ones were given to, you know, at the end of some sort of conflict or struggle, to memorize that particular struggle being finished. And so very, very complex system. But as I said, what it facilitates is this regional economy. And so you can move around and get, you know, taro, for example, from irrigated systems in various locations. There's not a lot of irrigated systems within Roviana itself, but there are other big ones in Columbangra in northern New Georgia. Not on Bella La Vella. You talk to people there and they say, you know, we ask them, well, you know, do you have any of these irrigation systems? And they say, no, but if you go over to North New Georgia, you can find some. And we grow bananas. We're not into taro. And we never found any in many valleys that we looked in Bella La Vella doing archaeology there. But anyhow, the other important thing, so there's all kinds of different commodities being moved around here. But one of the more important ones, ultimately, as we'll see, is this hawksbill turtle nesting grounds here, which is one of the biggest ones in the Pacific. And so lots of trade in commodities throughout this region. And Robiana they did a lot of manufacturing, and then they would move that stuff out into other locations. Other people would move in gnarly nuts, so they move in taro or tapa of various kinds. But it's a networked regional economy. Intensification here, ultimately, I think, is a political intensification around things like the headhunting complex. You don't become powerful by growing more taro locally because you've got this economic system which allow you to move food around from all different places. In Roviana, you get power by demonstrating your mana through successful headhunting. All efficacy, all ability comes from the ancestors. And so when you're successful, your status as a bangra or as a chief is determined. So as I said, chiefs use the shell money to fund all kinds of expenses, and including the construction of these canoes. And in the 19th century, we see there's some documented cases of maybe 100 canoes going. And they would go over to Choiseul or Santa Isabel. On occasion, they would go down to Guadalcanal. They were going all over the bloody place and with large numbers. And so you can think 30 men in each of those canoes, 100. That's a lot of people getting moved out and traveling regularly over 150 kilometers. The Spanish saw these canoes in 1568. Plank built, very light canoes which were very fast. And so as I said, chiefly Manas is demonstrated by the heads taken and displayed up in the rafters of the canoe houses. They brought back heads, but they also brought back a lot of captives. And the captives could be made use of in many different ways, but ultimately people married in with the captives. And the other interesting thing, at least I find it interesting, is that the captives usually retained their land rights in the places in which they came. And so through marrying some captive, you could get some rights in Santa Isabel. They weren't slaves like people like to imagine slavery. By the 19th century, this particular complex of the ancestral shrines, the shell valuables, the headhunting had spread throughout the whole region. And so you can just look at some of the terms similar. This is the shrine term for Hope here. Other places it's Sope up here in Bella La Vella, the Papuan island. They adopted all this Austronesian stuff. And Tambu, Tambuna, that's the same word used for Hope there. And so you see that complex throughout this region of the Western Solomons and spreading on over here a little bit. Just while I'm looking at this slide, one of those things slides indicates is the impact of headhunting. If you look at the distribution of languages, you can see what happens. People get pushed to the ends of these islands, and this is where much of the headhunting is going on. They're also getting turtle shell in here, and they combine the two activities quite often. So the 19th century, the next intrusion. The intrusion of the European economic system. In New Georgia, there's a series of potential commodities that Europeans could exploit. And they had different social relations of production and different exchange systems. So they have, the different commodities have different values. So we have whales, labor, bêche de mer, tortoise shell or hawksbill turtle, and copra. But each of those had different, you know, you want to exploit them. They had different implications for what you could do. Now, the Europeans, I mean, when people got to Botany Bay, one of the things they had was empty ships. And so early on, they would start sailing. Some of the earliest ships from Botany Bay actually tracked right up through here, past New Georgia and the Western Solomons, and then through this passage here. And then they could go on up to China and get cargoes or whatever. And that became quite, I mean, there's many other routes, of course, but that became quite a common one. And that meant that from a very early period, there's the interaction with people in the Western Solomons, with Europeans, not so much out here, but just up in there. The whalers, of course, were some of the earliest ones. They wanted wood, the water, women. There was limited trading possibilities. They could trade iron, ship's iron, and one of the things they liked to get was tortoise shell because it was highly valued and very light and easily procured. Didn't require any processing. But that had big impact. Venereal disease, dysentery, and so very early on we see this island here. So here, Roviana is up here. This is Rendova, or the name of Rendova probably actually comes from rendezvous, because this was one of the best harbors up here in the whole region. And so for whalers, it was probably Rendezvous Island, which became Rendova Island. But in the 1860s, this island, Tetapari, became completely depopulated, and today still is, I think, the largest uninhabited island in the Pacific. And it looks like that was a result of interaction with whalers very early on and disease impact on those people. The other material, the next one was the bêche de mer. Starting in about 1840, we get traders coming up here wanting, there's big demand in China for bêche de mer. And the thing with that is it's very labor intensive. You need local people, A, to go out and collect the bêche de mer in the lagoons. Then it has to be brought on land, then it has to be processed on land, and that, you know, requires cooperation with the chiefs and use of a large labor force. And it also, you know, is quickly, you know, you get rid of all the bêche de mer in your region, and so then you got to keep moving on. It's got particular characteristics, that particular economy. It requires the support and involvement of chiefs. And so the first people doing the bêche de mer collecting basically established relations with the chiefs, who then allowed them to build their facilities for drying the bêche de mer on land. And they would take local people on board their ships and transport them to big lagoons in New Georgia, but also over as far as Ontong Java, and to collect bêche de mer. Not sustainable. And then we got tortoiseshell, hawksbill turtle. Thing with it is it's light, very valuable. It's in demand in London, and it was in demand in Tanna in Vanuatu, because to get sandalwood, they wanted tortoiseshell. And it's easily depleted. It's a traditional material. There's no specialized on-land processing required. It's easily depleted. Again, it requires chiefly support and group hunting. And so the chiefs at that time would go out and sort of combine often headhunting and tortoiseshell collecting over in the straits between Choiseul and Santa Isabel. You know, wind up, the chiefs would accumulate huge amounts of this tortoiseshell. And then finally we have the labor trade. Now in 1871, which was, you know, the early part of the labor trade, where you have blackbirding, And you know, when it came up into the Western Solomons, it was the early, very violent form, where here we see a man from the Loyalty Islands testifying at a trial in Suva about the actions of his ship, where they came up into Roviana and they dropped iron through these canoes, and then they dove over and grabbed the men out of the canoes and then blocked them in the hold. Quickly, what happened in the Western Solomons is people just stayed away from the boats. And the labor trade never really developed in the Western Solomons. It's the Eastern Solomons is the major focus of the labor trade. And I guess at one level, these people, if you want European goods in Roviana, you go to the traders. In Malaita, there weren't so many traders. If you want European goods, you get involved with the labor trade. But in the Western Solomons, they seem to be allergic to any kind of labor of this kind. And of course, the traders would employ Malaitans mostly in their trading stations, you know, both because Malaitans seemed to be very keen on that kind of activity, but also because they weren't local. That meant they didn't have any obligations, local obligations, which could make things complicated. One thing, you know, another thing I would just mention here is that the labor trade itself, just imagine the holes it created in the social fabric of societies when people disappeared. You know, all of their you know, the things that they had to do within their society to be a good member of their society sort of got put on hold or disappeared. But then people also died. And so what happened? Where's so-and-so? Is he dead? And so if I gave you the 2-hour version of this, we could talk about the effects of killing 2 Malaitans on the station in Roviana Lagoon in the Eastern Solomons, because the word traveled. And I believe it's true that the brother of the man killed in Roviana at that time, William Dabele, his brother got killed in Uki just off of Makira at about the same time. And I think because of the death of the Malaitans at that station. But anyhow. Finally, we have copra. In 1869, Weber started drying copra in Samoa. Before that, you have oil, but it was really difficult, I mean, to get clean oil, and it was not easy at all. But once we started drying, making copra, it became much easier commodity to work with. But it was basically family-level thing. Everyone could have coconut trees or could get coconut and dry. It was labor-intensive. It was family-level thing. It wasn't so much that you didn't have to be a chief or get the chief's permission, although it was probably somewhat complicated, but to trade copra. And so before we needed the chief's support. It was a chiefly kind of activity, and now it's much more of a family-based activity. It was in direct development of this trade, progress of this trade, the progress to say, you know, development of plantations was in direct contradiction with the chiefly political economy of the Roviana region. It required resident traders, and ultimately, as I said, plantation, copra production. And I think the man, the owner of this station that was attacked, he got attacked because he kicked in the side of a canoe of a big man in South Bella Lavella, where he was trying to get land rights to an island to develop copra plantation. And so it was a big argument. And so these men from Bella Lavella, who were sort of supporters of the big man in Bella Lavella, came and did a number on him. So here's the stations in 1880. Here's Peter Pratt Edmonds. He's the owner of this particular station. He was a real Pratt. He was French. Again, I don't have time to go into all the details, but he became naturalized in New South Wales, and then went up into the Solomons, and where, depending upon what was happening, he would fly a French flag or a British flag. If he was trading guns, he was French, because it was against British law to trade guns. But if he wanted to come and complain and get some support, he'd come down to Sydney, and then that's where he's being, you know, his supplies from in Sydney, and he would write to the Sydney Morning Herald about the terrible things happening, the outrages happening in the Solomon Islands. And there was 6 here by 1886. Nowhere else in the Solomons do you get that kind of concentration of traders, or Western traders. This was an optimal location, not just for Roviana people, but for the Western traders who could access all of this material in that region. And so there was a lot of lobbying. So here's, you know, a report, the Sydney Morning Herald, 1880, the recent horrible outrages at the Solomon Islands. And this was related to some earlier events in Rendova, just in the Western Solomons as well. And here we see George Brown, a famous Methodist missionary, who was actually a missionary up in New Britain. Previously that, he'd been a very successful missionary in Samoa. I'm coming to the end here. He would go between Sydney and New Britain, and he would stop in Roviana. And each time he'd go there, he'd say to the Roviana people, "So when can we come and missionize here?" And then they would say, "No." Or they would say, "So you want us to all die like the people in Bugotu?" Where the Anglicans had created a school, and the young men from all the chiefs went there, got influenza or whatever, and died. And the people in Roviana said, "No, we don't want any part of that." So it was a very hard sell. But he could go stop there with the traders and on his way to Sydney and see what was going on. So we have a lot written by him about Roviana. Mission doesn't come until 1902. But anyhow, you know, they complained to him about what should be done. You know, we should get some ringleaders. We should get rid of the canoes, and that's what Davis was doing essentially. As I said, the impact was horrific, and based on population estimates, I think about 3,000 people would have been affected. But it didn't necessarily stop the headhunting right away. Here we can see, and this happened before, Ingava died in 1906, so this event's before 1906, some years before 1906, when they went over to where the tortoiseshell nesting grounds were, and brought back a lot of heads. But in terms of European trade and export, we can see, you know, early on the chiefly production, tortoiseshell, very important. And then we see here, and then, you know, down in here there's a lot of headhunting going on, things are getting very difficult. We see the punitive expedition, and then we see tortoiseshell, because there's been accumulated tortoiseshell, but also we certainly see the family-based production of copra just skyrockets after this time. So, you know, their ending of headhunting and the destruction ultimately of that political economy and all that went with it allowed the development of Western economics in the region. So why this event this time? Well, as I said, there's geography, optimal location, culture, core Austronesian concepts being used to develop headhunting political economy and all that went with that. And then colonial capitalism has switched from commodities in harmony with the local political economy to one based on family level production. Here you can see Pratt trading in Simbo probably. Mission came in 1902. Another aside, the current Vice Chancellor of the Solomon Islands National University in Honiara is a direct descendant of the first Solomon Islander who came with the first Methodist group to establish a mission in Roviana. He had been working in Fiji and wrote repeatedly to the Methodists saying, "Please come to the Solomon." He was from Guadalcanal. "Please come to the Solomon Islands." And they said, "Well, you know, the Anglicans and Catholics already got it sewed up, and what can we do?" But George Brown wrote to the Anglicans and Catholics, and he said, "Well, you can go to Roviana. No one wants to go there." And so they did in 1902. And what they, in their ideas of industrial mission, was develop copra plantations on that flats all behind where Ingava's canoe houses were. Here's the road that went ultimately to the mission through the developing copra plantations. So here's a new airstrip opened in exactly the same thing. Opened this last week, I think, was the opening, official opening of the new airstrip in Munda. And I think probably soon you'll be able to fly directly from Brisbane to Munda and visit. And so that island, Nusa Zonga, is just there, and that's where Davis came. And Ingava's canoe houses were probably just up here along where Agnes Lodge accommodation is located in here. This was originally built by the Japanese, of course, and it was actually bigger than this airstrip when it was Japanese. Anyhow, thank you very much for your attention, and as they say in Roviana, liana hola. Did it go on too long, Stuart?
Yeah, you did.
I did.
No questions. You planned that.
Huh?
No, that's good. Yeah, no, great. Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. And the striking thing for me, the parallels of the whole series of pressures and things, in particular when you mentioned the labour trade and how it strips villages of, often the most able communities, and ceremonies is put off, and we're seeing that very, 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 very clearly in Vanuatu at the moment, where thousands and thousands of people are involved in what now is called seasonal work. But anyway, I think we'll leave it there because we've got drinks and snacks just next door, and I expect to see everyone there and can further discuss things with Peter and mix and mingle amongst yourselves. Thanks very much.
Oh, shit. I should have put my phone on.
Okay. Well, you didn't start the 10 past.